With my mug full of tea and my heart full of anguish, I am going to tell you about the most disappointing books I read in 2023. Starting off with a double corker, It Ends With Us and It Starts With Us by Colleen Hoover. I read these books as part of a video where I was trying to become less of a book snob. In that video, I did read a lot of books that really did enlighten me. However, Colleen Hoover shocked me. I wasn't expecting loads because by this point already the internet was like obsessed with how bad Colleen Hoover's writing was. So yeah, the bar was set pretty low, and yet still I was quite disappointed. It Starts With Us and It Ends With Us are a series, a duo. The positive is probably just that I appreciated the depiction of domestic violence. It's about a woman in an incredibly toxic relationship. She meets a guy who seems pretty dodgy from the outset, but anyway, let's try not to be too negative. And she falls in love with him, and then he has really bad anger issues and starts to abuse her. I do think that the kind of gaslighting, confusion, like those elements were generally quite well depicted, like this feeling of like, how can someone who loves me hurt me this much? There's a good message in there, but the writing was just so patronizing. Is that the right word? Everything had to be iterated and reiterated and reiterated 3 or 4 times. The pages didn't really flow by because I was just getting so bored. You would read something and understand a point, and then the next sentence would just be the same point again but slightly reworded, and that annoyed me to absolutely no end. There's also a lot of cringe in there, which I'm sure you're aware of. I'm sure the internet has made you aware of. Reading about their sexual chemistry was unpleasant. I didn't enjoy it at all. Next up, we have a book that honestly everybody loves. I'm really struggling to find much validation from the internet, and this again is another kind of contemporary one that all the booktubers and the booktalkers are going on about, and that is The Guest by Emma Cline. The Guest is about a woman who, she's just been dumped by her really rich boyfriend, a really rich older boyfriend, and she's not really rich herself. She's trying to stay in the area until his 4th of July party, and she's kind of hoping she can win him back then. The party's in like a week. It's like a little bit of an adventure, and it's kind of about her being shut out and all the subtle ways that the wealthier people make her feel unwelcome. People love it. People love this book, and so I thought I'd really like this book, and I didn't like it at all. I found the protagonist just too irritating. I don't always have to like a protagonist to enjoy the book, but she did this thing where she would kind of attempt to be self-aware, and as a result just seem even less self-aware than before. It's realistic for someone to have flaws, but it felt like we were meant to like this character, and I just really didn't. And I also just found the plot dull. I was just getting bored. I don't know what else to say. I was getting really bored, and the concept I really liked, so I was just expecting great things. There were some really intelligent moments and some really kind of incisive, you know, some good observational writing, but overall I found it boring. And I would like to add that I have since read The Girls, which is another book by Emma Cline. The Girls kind of felt like a much better version of The Guest. I actually think The Girls was written first, maybe. I think The Guest is like her more recent one, but it honestly, you could see the same style in both the books. Like there's this really clear Emma Cline way of writing and just subject matter as well, but The Girls just felt like a better version, just a more mature, more insightful version of The Guest, which is interesting. Like maybe she just tried a bit too hard to kind of make The Girls 2.0, you know. Forever by Judy Blume was another disappointment that I endured last year. No, that's harsh. I read it because I was doing like a Phoebe Waller-Bridge favourite reads video, and so I was really, expectations were high, and especially reading around it. Forever is a very iconic book about kind of growing up. It was published in the 70s, and for that time it was very iconic. It was quite controversial because Judy Blume had previously written books for kind of kids up to 12, and this book did have sexual content and was definitely aimed at slightly older people. I can see how for the 70s it would have made a splash and been a really brilliant, valuable book, but reading it now, it was fine. It was fine. I get it, but I think it was a kind of misjudgment on my part. The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon. This one, like when I read it, and spoke about it on my channel for the first time, very controversial. A lot of people absolutely love this book. It's about a woman who unravels a really complex, confusing conspiracy that involves a secret underground postal system. And it is, as described by Google, filled with complex characters and intricate plot twists. It explores themes of communication, control, and the elusive nature of truth. Talking about it now, I actually might give it a reread. I'm not ready yet, maybe next year, 2025, because I really didn't. I think I gave this book 2 stars even, which is wild for me. I'm a pretty generous 3-star giver, aren't we all? I found it just impossible to get into. I didn't really care about the characters much, and caring about the characters is quite important to me, and it was confusing. It was too confusing. I feel like you're kind of meant to embrace the fact that you don't understand what's going on, because a lot of the twists were just so weird and complicated, and nothing was written clearly. Like it drove me mad trying to understand what's happening, and then the moment you think you understand what's happening changes. So it was just way too confusing, and as a result I couldn't get into it at all. Right, every opportunity I get I will yak about this book. That is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. You probably know what it's about. Someone called Frankenstein creates a monster that is Frankenstein's monster, and he kind of abandons it because he's like, oh my god, you're so ugly and weird, and he abandons the monster. And the book is really about that monster being rejected, not just by its creator but by society. And it has some pretty good messages in there. Loads of the characters and their kind of interactions just didn't make sense to me. I think, so the book was published in the 1800s, I believe, and I think sometimes you read books and they feel so modern, even though they're really old. But this one, there were just too many things that I didn't understand that maybe would have made sense at the time, and it was just a bit of a cultural difference, but it really stopped me from enjoying the book to its fullest potential. I also found Frankenstein, the character, insufferable. I think that was kind of the point. He had just neglected something that he had created, but he just got too much camera time. I was sick of him. And I didn't want to continue reading. I get it though. I get the hype. I just didn't like the book. I actually recently read Poor Things and watched the film, and that's heavily inspired by Frankenstein, and good for them. I really enjoyed that. Frankenstein's clearly iconic for good reason. I just didn't like reading the book. The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. This is described as the grief Bible. Everyone absolutely raves about it, and that's why my expectations were relatively high. And to be honest, to put it bluntly, I just felt like the book lacked emotion. The writing was good. It was kind of just as good as you would expect from such a well-known, celebrated author as Joan Didion, but it was almost too good. I find memoirs are really interesting because you have to be incredibly self-aware and you know, you're reflecting on your own existence, your own life, your own, like, who you are. But there's definitely such a thing as too self-aware. It didn't feel like it really poured out of her. It definitely felt like a lot of it was really, really considered and almost sterile. I understand that for some people, like, that was probably what her experience was of grief was like there's this kind of level of detachment. The year in general, so it was after her husband died and then her daughter was really, really ill, and I think her daughter did eventually die, so she was having a terrible, terrible time. So I don't blame her for detaching a bit, but it just didn't make for good grief reading. Oh, I mean, it was good, but it didn't make for really, really powerful grief reading. Brideshead Revisited, I read it because Saltburn, the film, is apparently based on it or just heavily inspired by it, and I did enjoy the style. The prose was really beautiful. It was a very, like, vivid atmosphere, but I got bored. I just didn't care for the plot. I wanted the book to end, and that's that. The Stranger by Albert Camus. I had really high expectations because it's not a very long book, so I thought, you know, at the very least it'll be short and punchy, and people also rave about it. People really, really go on about it, and it was thought-provoking. It was pretty unique to me. I don't usually read books like it, but it ultimately was just way too much of a grind. I felt myself not being that keen to continue, and I don't know, it felt like a lot of brain power was needed for very sort of average reward. Camus' whole thing is like very short sentences, very simple language, you know, it's just really, really stripped back, and the message of The Stranger is meant to be just like the meaninglessness of life. So I just think I'm not, like, as a person, I'm not compatible with that message, and that also influenced my reading experience. The Testaments by Margret Atwood. This is probably my most heartbreaking disappointment. The Handmaid's Tale is one of my favourite books ever, and I also read that this year. So immediately after, when I saw that The Testaments was also at the library, I picked it up because The Testaments is the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, and honestly, it was as though they were written by completely different authors. The Testaments isn't a bad book, but my expectations were raised so massively by The Handmaid's Tale, which I consider pretty perfect. It was so intelligent and gripping and just made me feel so many things, and then The Testaments just felt so kind of average by comparison. Definitely not the book that I thought was the worst in this list. In fact, it's probably one of the best books in this list, but I think one of the most disappointing. Everything I Know About Love by Dolly Alderton. I am endlessly wrestling with my feelings about this book. I definitely appreciate why people would like it. I read it because so many people around me read it. Like, if it's kind of considered one of the ultimate lost gal in her 20s books, especially like if you're British, and it's described as really funny, and I do sort of get it. It didn't make me laugh, but it was humorous, and it is honest. But I don't know, as I mentioned, memoirs are tricky, and I sometimes find myself getting icked out by how self-absorbed the author feels, and this was a memoir where I just got icked out for that reason. Memoirs are obviously by nature a kind of self-absorbed thing to write, but sometimes they hit and sometimes they miss, and this really missed for me. Lessons by Ian McEwan. This book is enormous, and I think that's a part of my rage towards it. I actually can't remember how many pages it is, but you know, it's on the bigger side, and so when you also end up not enjoying it, like the amount of time that I invested in this story only to be quite sort of disappointed in the end, I don't like to think about. I expected really good things because, well, everyone loves it. It has really, really high reviews, and Ian McEwan is obviously a very established author. I have read some Ian McEwan, not loads, but I have read Ian McEwan and I have enjoyed his writing in the past. So I was like, yeah, I'm gonna invest a bit of time into lessons. Like, let's have a look. I actually in some ways found this book quite awful. Seems really mean. He'll be fine. Ian will be fine. It was very detached. The overall story as well, it's about a lot of things. There are a lot of kind of historical events going on at the time, and you've got a lot of quite complex characters, which I usually like. I usually like a really kind of character driven book, but you didn't really have any emotion in there. It's just full of incredibly long, winding paragraphs, and I like a bit of meandering, but again, in this book, it just didn't work for me. It just got me lost and frustrated, and I didn't really see the point in them. I was like, why can't this just be a little bit more concise? I don't know. Overall, it just kind of was documenting this person's entire life, but it didn't really make me care about the person that much. And so it was like kind of reading a textbook, I guess. Okay, we've got to the end of my moan. I don't know, I have mixed feelings about really negative videos, but here we are. I hope you enjoyed. Obviously, take this with a grain of salt. Who cares, you know? Who cares about my opinion? And if you enjoyed any of these books, I'm curious as to like why you enjoyed them. Tell me why you disagree. Tell me why I'm wrong. I hope you have a lovely week. I hope you've had a lovely day. I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.